After 12 years of marriage, my in-laws declared, "Our son deserves someone from a better family." Revenge was served cold. You need to be realistic, Matthew. 12 years is long enough for this. Experiment. You deserve someone from a better family, someone like Eleanor, who understands our world. Evelyn Wellington's words hung in the air of my own living room, every syllable perfectly articulated in her elite Boston accent. I stood frozen at the doorway, my luggage from my trip still in hand, as I took in the surreal scene before me. My husband, Matt, sitting silently between his parents and a woman I instantly recognized as his ex-girlfriend from college. "Think of the Wellington legacy, son," Howard added, his paternal tone laced with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Some differences simply can't be overcome, no matter how much time passes." 12 years. 12 years of marriage. Over a decade of trying to prove my worth to this family who, despite their polite smiles and toasts at special occasions, had never seen me as anything more than an intruder, the housekeeper's daughter who somehow managed to win over their precious heir. Matt's silence at that moment, that hesitation that lasted only a few seconds but stretched into an eternity, cut deeper than all the subtle insults and passive-aggressive remarks I had endured over the years. I had just returned early from a European tour where I had received an international award for my work as a chef. I wanted to surprise my husband, maybe open that special bottle of wine we had been saving for important occasions. Instead, I walked into a full-fledged family intervention, orchestrated to replace me while I was away celebrating the peak of my career. What none of them knew, as they discussed my fate as if I were a mistake to be corrected, was that this moment would not mark the end of my marriage, but rather the beginning of a transformation none of them could have foreseen. Because some people only realize their true worth when they stop seeking validation from those who never intended to give it. And as for revenge? Well, as any skilled chef knows, the most memorable dishes are served at the perfect temperature, and mine would be served cold. I met Matthew Wellington during my 3rd year as a sous chef at Maison Laurent, one of the most prestigious French restaurants in Boston. It was a busy Friday night, and he was celebrating his master's degree in English literature with a group of elegant, well-spoken friends. Fate intervened in the form of a tray of flambéed shrimp, which a nervous waiter tripped over, sending cognac sauce splattering all over Matt's Italian blazer. As the chef in charge of the seafood station that night, I was called in for an official apology. "I can save your blazer," I offered to the aristocratic-looking man who was clearly embarrassed, guiding him into the kitchen. "I have a technique for removing butter-based sauce stains. As I worked on the stain with a homemade solution my mother had taught me, we talked. To my surprise, he seemed more interested in my stain removal technique than he was in his ruined blazer. "This is fascinating," he remarked as I explained the chemistry behind my remedy. "Where did you learn this trick?" "From my mother. She's been a housekeeper in Beacon Hill for 30 years. She knows all the tricks to save expensive clothes." Instead of the discomfort or abrupt end to the conversation I had expected, Matt asked to hear more. Soon we were talking about food, literature, and the curious intersection of social classes in spaces like fine dining restaurants. Before he left the kitchen, he surprised me with an invitation. "There's a new Peruvian restaurant in the South End. Would you like to go with me next week and give me your professional opinion?" I accepted, convinced that he would forget about it as soon as he returned to his privileged world. But the following Wednesday, there he was, promptly at 7, waiting for me outside the staff entrance. Our first year together was a dance between worlds. I, Sofia Rivera, daughter of Isabel, a Salvadoran immigrant who had raised her daughter alone after being widowed young, hesitantly stepping into the privileged spaces of Matthew Wellington, heir to a banking fortune with roots tracing back to the first Massachusetts settlers. Matt seemed fascinated by what he called my authenticity, my straightforward passion for food, my relentless work ethic, the stories of growing up in a cramped apartment in Providence where I learned to cook at 8 years old while my mother worked 3 different jobs. "You see the world in a way that no one in my circle does," he told me one night after I had improvised a meal with the few basic ingredients I found in his ridiculously empty fridge. No filters, no pretense. When he proposed 2 years later, in an intimate moment in my tiny kitchen rather than at some fancy restaurant, I believed that our love would overcome our differences in background. My mother's reaction was more pragmatic. "Mija, she said in Spanish as she examined the diamond ring that looked absurdly large on my calloused chef's hands. "He may truly love you, but his family, they will never really accept you. People like the Wellingtons don't marry housekeepers' daughters." My first meeting with Evelyn and Howard Wellington confirmed my mother's fears. In their elegant apartment overlooking Boston Common, I was subjected to a veiled interrogation about my family lineage. "And your father was?" Evelyn let the question hang in the air, holding her wine glass as if it were an extension of her perfectly manicured fingers. "A car mechanic," I answered honestly. "He immigrated from El Salvador, met my mother in Providence, and passed away when I was 6. "Ah," she replied, exchanging a significant glance with Howard. "How unusual." The wedding Matt and I had envisioned as a small intimate ceremony had been transformed, at Evelyn's insistence, into a lavish social event. "If this is going to happen," she had told Matt, who later told me, "then at least let's make sure it's worthy of the Wellington name." I found myself at the center of a spectacle with 300 guests, most of whom I had never met, prominent. Bankers, local politicians, members of old Boston families whose names adorned university buildings and hospital wings. My side of the church was noticeably smaller. My mother, cousins, a few friends from the restaurant industry, all of them visibly uncomfortable in their formal attire. During the reception, I overheard a guest asking another, unaware that I was passing by, "So, which family is she from?" "None that you'd know," came the hushed reply. "Apparently, her mother works for the Hartwells as a maid." The shocked silence that followed took many forms throughout the early years of our marriage. At Wellington social events, I was treated with polite superficiality that barely masked a condescending curiosity. People would ask me about ethnic cuisine as if it were an exotic concept or comment on how I didn't even look Latin American. Evelyn referred to me as the chef instead of my daughter-in-law when introducing me. Howard occasionally made remarks about how I had risen above my humble beginnings, as if my identity were an obstacle that had been removed, rather than an integral part of who I am. For years, I believed that with enough time, enough patience, enough achievements, I would eventually be accepted. That if I worked hard enough, I would prove my worth. That one day, the experiment, as Evelyn had just called my 12-year marriage, would finally be deemed a success. How naive I was. During the first years of our marriage, Matt and I found a rhythm that worked for us, despite the underlying family tensions. He secured a position as an assistant professor in Boston University's literature department, and I continued climbing the ranks at Maison Laurent's kitchen, eventually becoming chef de cuisine. But I had bigger dreams. I had always wanted to create dishes that honored my Salvadoran roots, blending the classic French techniques I had mastered with the flavors and traditions I had grown up loving. Matt fully supported my vision, and together, we saved for 3 years so we could invest in our own small restaurant, Raíces. Was born in a modest space in the South End, just 10 tables in an old building that we mostly renovated with our own hands. Matt painted the walls in shades of terracotta and gold, while I meticulously planned my dream kitchen. I invited my longtime friend Camila Rodriguez to join as a partner and sommelier. We needed her expertise in wine and her management skills, as I planned to spend most of my time in the kitchen. The first few months were brutal. We worked 16-hour days, often ending up in the red. A mediocre review nearly crushed us in the 3rd month. Matt took on extra academic writing gigs to help cover expenses, while Camilla and I took turns playing hostess, waitress, dishwasher, whatever was necessary. "You should take my father's offer," Matt hesitantly suggested one night after we had closed with only 2 occupied tables. Howard had offered a family loan to keep us afloat, with the implicit condition that I adapt the menu to something more accessible to Boston's crowd. "No," I answered firmly. "We'll make it on our own, or we won't make it at all. But it will be our success or our failure, not theirs." The turning point came slowly, then all at once. A prominent food blogger discovered our scallop ceviche with coconut and passion fruit foam. A short mention in the Boston Globe described our mole negro over confit duck as a cultural and culinary revelation. Customers began booking tables weeks in advance. 7 years into our marriage, I received my first 5-star review in the Globe, followed 2 months later by an extensive profile in food and wine. Suddenly, Races became one of the hardest reservations to get in the city. We expanded to a larger space on the same street, tripling our capacity while maintaining an intimate atmosphere. The irony of my new social position wasn't lost on me. The same circles that had looked down on me at Wellington parties were now scrambling for a table at my restaurant. Invitations to cook at elite charity events started arriving, including the annual Wellington Foundation for the Arts Gala, chaired by Howard. We're very proud, of course. Evelyn commented when she saw me receiving praise from guests at the event. We always knew you had potential. Her compliment, as always, came with a subtle reminder of my place. It's fascinating how you've managed to elevate such simple and rustic ingredients into something even our most sophisticated friends can enjoy. Over the years, I noticed a shift in my in-laws' behavior. The initial disdain had transformed into something more complex, a mix of possessive pride and constant reassessment, as if I were a risky investment that had begun yielding unexpected returns. Publicly, they started introducing me as our talented daughter-in-law, the chef, a title that emphasized my usefulness more than my belonging. Privately, they continued to treat our marriage as a temporary phase in Matt's life. You're really not planning to hire a manager soon? Howard asked during a family dinner when I mentioned the possibility of opening a second restaurant. Surely there will come a time when you'll want to focus on family. His euphemism for having children was as transparent as it was condescending. My relationship with Lucas, Matt's older brother, took an unexpected turn. Initially the most openly disdainful of the family, referring to my creations as glorified street food, he gradually developed a reluctant respect. The shift came after I prepared a dinner that impressed his high-profile corporate law clients. You actually know what you're doing, he admitted afterward as we sipped digestives. Coming from Lucas, that was practically a declaration of admiration. The peak of this phase of my career came when I was named Chef of the Year by a prestigious culinary publication. The cover story recounted my journey without sugarcoating, the daughter of a widowed housekeeper who worked 3 jobs to raise me, my first steps in the kitchen at age 8 cooking for myself, my determination to preserve and elevate recipes that represented my cultural heritage. Matt framed the magazine and proudly hung it in our apartment, a cozy loft in Cambridge that we had bought with the profits from races. When Evelyn saw the article during a visit, she simply murmured, "Fascinating how they glamorize the most unusual stories these days." At that moment, I smiled politely, as I had done hundreds of times before. But a small voice inside me was beginning to question how much longer I would continue accepting such comments as the price to pay for my place in the Wellington family. The answer, though I didn't know it then, would be exactly 12 years. By our 10th year of marriage, our life seemed firmly established. With Races' continued success, we had opened a second location in a historic Boston neighborhood. My first cookbook, Crossed Roots, A Culinary Journey Across Borders, had made it to the New York Times bestseller list in the gastronomy category. Matt, now a tenured professor, had been promoted to head of the English literature department, the youngest to ever hold the position in the university's history. We bought a Victorian house in Cambridge, not as grand as the Wellington mansion in Beacon Hill, but a home that reflected our shared personality. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in the living room, vibrant artwork from Latin American artists on the walls, and a kitchen that was the true heart of the house, equipped with professional appliances and a spacious central island where I experimented with new recipes while Matt graded students' papers. The first serious crack in our carefully built life appeared when my mother, Isabel, was diagnosed with a heart condition that required constant care. Without a moment's hesitation, we invited her to live with us. Matt, always the kind man, I loved, transformed the downstairs office into a comfortable bedroom, installing handrails and adapting the adjacent bathroom to meet her needs. When we informed the Wellingtons about this arrangement during one of the Sunday lunches we still maintained at Matt's insistence, Evelyn's reaction was immediate and cutting. "You're really bringing your mother to live in your house?" she asked. Her teacup paused halfway to her lips. "There are excellent facilities for that kind of situation. We could help financially if that's the issue." In my culture, taking care of elderly parents is a sacred responsibility, I responded as calmly as possible. It's not a situation, it's family. Ah yes, She smiled coolly. Your traditions are so quaint. Things got worse during Howard's 70th birthday party, a grand celebration at their mansion in Beacon Hill. Evelyn had planned every detail impeccably, except for the dietary considerations for my mother, who had strict restrictions due to her heart condition. Oh dear, it's so hard to keep up with all these limitations of the working class, Evelyn remarked when I discreetly mentioned that there was nothing my mother could eat at the elaborate buffet. It was in that moment that I saw something shift in Matt's expression, a late realization, perhaps, that his mother wasn't simply being difficult or old-fashioned, as he often excused her behavior. She was being deliberately cruel. Yet even with this growing discomfort, Matt still tried to keep the peace. I noticed he began looking more stressed, constantly mediating between two worlds that seemed increasingly irreconcilable. I found out that Evelyn had intensified her private conversations with him, weekly calls and lunches where she questioned our life choices. She's just concerned about the family lineage, Matt tried to explain after one of those lunches. The idea of a Wellington heir is important to her. Matt, we've been together for over a decade. We agreed we weren't ready for kids yet. Has that changed for you? No, he quickly reassured me. I'm just explaining her perspective. Always her perspective. Always trying to translate her family's elitism into more palatable terms. I started wondering how much longer we could continue in this limbo, deeply in love with each other, yet constantly judged by half of the family equation. The answer came on our 12th wedding anniversary. I received the prestigious Gastronome d'Or award, which led to a 2-week tour across Europe, giving lectures and attending culinary events. Matt couldn't join me due to unavoidable academics commitments. His semester was ending, and as the head of his department, he had responsibilities he couldn't delegate. I'm going to miss you, he said at the airport, holding me tight, but I'm so proud. You deserve all this recognition. Something about the tour, perhaps the physical distance from the toxic family dynamics, or being surrounded by chefs who treated me with genuine respect based purely on my talent, rekindled a spark of clarity within me. I decided to return 2 days earlier than planned, eager to surprise Matt with exciting news. I had received an offer to write a monthly column for an international culinary magazine. My flight was delayed, and I arrived home late at night. I noticed the lights on and voices coming from the living room. Matt apparently had company, despite the hour. Wanting to make a discreet entrance, I used my key to enter through the kitchen door. That's when I heard Evelyn's voice, crystal clear and confident. Matt, darling, you need to be realistic. 12 years is long enough for this experiment. You deserve someone from a better family, someone like Eleanor, who understands our world. Eleanor? The name was familiar from old stories. Matt's college ex-girlfriend, from a proper Beacon Hill family, the one his parents had always approved of. Silently approaching the living room entrance, I took in the full scene. Matt sat uncomfortably between his parents, while an elegant blonde woman, undoubtedly Eleanor, was seated close by, her knees nearly touching his. On the coffee table, family albums lay open, and several bottles of expensive wine, from the year of our favorite vintage, I noted with a sharp pang, were nearly empty. Think of the Wellington legacy, son, Howard added solemnly. Some differences simply can't be overcome, no matter how much time passes. Matt's silence in that moment, those few seconds when he didn't immediately defend me, didn't stand up in outrage, didn't throw his parents out of our home, was more devastating than any words that could have been spoken. That was when I let my suitcases drop to the floor, announcing my presence. 4 faces turned toward me simultaneously. Howard, with a hint of awkwardness. Evelyn, whose aristocratic composure didn't falter for a second. Eleanor, looking genuinely mortified. And Matt, my husband of 12 years, whose face paled with a mixture of shock and guilt that told me everything I needed to know. Sophia, he exclaimed, quickly standing up. You got home early. Yes, I had arrived early, before they could finalize their plans to replace me, before Matt could be fully persuaded to discard 12 years of our life together, before the perfect Eleanor could take my place in the Wellington dynasty. But I had also arrived too late, for some things. Too late for the illusion that I would ever truly be accepted. Too late for the belief that Matt would one day set clear boundaries with his parents. Too late, perhaps, to save a marriage that had been eroded by years of tolerating the intolerable. Yes, I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. I got home a little earlier than expected. The confrontation that followed my unexpected arrival was seismic. A heavy silence filled the room for a few seconds. The kind of silence thick with tension, the kind that precedes devastating storms. Evelyn was the first to regain composure, her face a mask of false cordiality. "Sophia, dear, what a delightful surprise," she said, as if I had interrupted an afternoon tea and not a meeting to dissolve my marriage. "We were just having a little family gathering." "I noticed that," I responded, my voice trembling with restrained fury, "and it seems you were deciding my future without me." Eleanor, to her credit, looked genuinely mortified. "I should go," she murmured, grabbing her purse quickly. "This was a mistake." "I'm sorry, Sophia." Howard stood up, adopting that paternalistic tone he used to shut down uncomfortable discussions at family dinners. "I think we all need a little space for appropriate conversations. Matthew, we'll call you tomorrow." "You're not going anywhere," I declared, blocking the doorway. "Not until you explain exactly what's going on in my house with my husband." Matt finally found his voice, though it was weak. "Sophia, this isn't." They showed up unannounced, with Eleanor. How long?" I cut him off, looking directly at him. "How long has this been happening behind my back?" "Dear," Evelyn interjected, "there's no need for Latino drama. We're simply having a family discussion about Matthew's future." That phrase, Latino drama, was the final straw. 12 years of condescending remarks, microaggressions, and veiled rejection exploded inside me. Not another word. I pronounced each syllable as I would when teaching a sous chef a crucial technique. "This is no longer your stage, Evelyn. You don't control this narrative." I turned to Matt, who looked both relieved by my intervention and terrified by the impending confrontation. "I want your parents to leave now, then we'll talk." To my surprise, it was Howard who gave in first. "Come on, Evelyn," he said, touching his wife's arm. There was something in his eyes, not exactly shame, but perhaps a late acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. "This has gone too far." "Too far?" Evelyn seemed genuinely surprised, as if she couldn't comprehend why her interference would be inappropriate. "We're only thinking about what's best for the family." "I am his family," I replied with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. "For 12 years, and you never, not for a moment, tried to be mine." After the Wellingtons' stormy exit, the silence in our home was deafening. Matt and I stared at each other like strangers, the chasm between us suddenly visible and seemingly insurmountable. "Please tell me this wasn't your idea," I finally said. "Please tell me you weren't planning to leave me while I was away receiving the biggest recognition of my career." "No!" he exclaimed, looking genuinely horrified. "They showed up unannounced, with Eleanor. They said they wanted to discuss the future of the family. I had no idea." "But you didn't send them away," I pointed out. "You sat there listening, while your mother called me an experiment that had gone on too long." The painful truth hung between us. Even if he hadn't actively participated in the plan, he had allowed things to reach this point by never setting clear boundaries with his parents. "What else is happening that I don't know about?" I asked, a sudden thought occurring to me. Was this the first time they brought in a replacement, or just the first time I found out? Matt's hesitation told me everything. "There have been other times," he finally admitted. "I always managed to push them away. I never took it seriously, but you never told me," I finished for him. "You never thought your wife deserved to know that your parents were actively trying to end our marriage." "I was protecting you," he protested. "I didn't want you to feel even more isolated or rejected. They're difficult, old-fashioned, but they're my family." "I never asked you to choose between me and your family," I said, exhaustion finally hitting me. "But I did expect that after 12 years, you would have made it clear to them that I am your family." Matt swore he would make changes, set firm boundaries with his parents, even suggested a period of no contact until they properly apologized. But as he spoke, I looked at our home with new eyes, the family photos on the walls, the blending of our lives, the space we had built together. Something fundamental had been broken, and no promise of future change seemed enough to fix it. The next morning, I made a decision I never thought I would. I packed a few essential bags and temporarily moved into the small apartment above the first races, now used as an office and test kitchen. I needed space to think, away from Matt's pleading eyes and the memories of a family that had never considered me their own. My mother, Isabel, whom I had helped move into the apartment with me, with nursing assistance when I was at the restaurant, wasn't surprised when I explained what had happened. "Mia," she said as we settled into the makeshift space, "I told you 12 years ago they would never truly accept you. But I don't blame you for trying. The heart wants what it wants, and you've always had a stubborn heart." A week after I left, I received an unexpected visit at the restaurant. Lucas, Matt's brother. Unlike the usual restraint of the Wellingtons, he seemed genuinely unsettled. "Can we talk?" he asked, looking out of place amid the lunchtime preparations. "In private?" In the small office at the back, Lucas stunned me with a revelation that rewrote my understanding of the past few years. "You need to know that this wasn't my mother's first intervention," he began, uncomfortable but determined. "I've been watching this for years. Every time you traveled for work, she arranged casual meetings with potential replacements. And Matt..." I could barely form the question. "He always rejected their attempts," Lucas quickly confirmed. "But he also never seriously confronted our parents about it. Or told you." The revelation was both a confirmation and a new betrayal. Matt had protected me from the worst of his parents' schemes, but by doing so in secret, he had become a subtle accomplice in their actions. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, studying the face of the man who had initially been my most vocal critic in the Wellington family. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare sign of disorder for someone so controlled. "I'm not defending our parents. They're products of an era and a mindset that needs to end. But I think you deserve to know the whole truth before making any final decisions." As he left, he added something that stayed with me for days. "You know, for years I thought Matt was weak for not following the path our family set for him. Now I realize that maybe he's the only one of us with enough courage to try to be happy on his own terms, even if he wasn't brave enough to defend it properly." That night, I cried myself to sleep, not just for the marriage that was falling apart, but for the family I never had a chance to have. And, perhaps most painfully, for the realization that my husband, whom I loved deeply, had never been as strong as I needed him to be. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work as a way to process my emotions. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary, the place where I transformed raw emotions into something nourishing and beautiful. Now it became my refuge from the storm of conflicting feelings threatening to consume me. I created new dishes, fusing classic French techniques with the homemade recipes my mother had taught me, a culinary reflection of the duality I had lived for 12 years. Every ingredient I handled seemed to tell part of my story, Salvadoran. Peppers grown alongside Provençal herbs, fine dining techniques applied to recipes that women like my mother had cooked for generations on simple stovetops. "What are you doing, ma mija?" Isabel asked one night, watching me test the 5th variation of a dessert at 3 in the morning. "This isn't just cooking." "I'm trying to understand," I replied, caramelizing plantains with an almost obsessive precision. 12 years, Mama. 12 years trying to be good enough for a family that decided from the start that I never would be. Isabel stepped closer, her pace slower since her heart had begun to fail, but her eyes still carried the sharp wisdom that had guided our small family through so many hardships. "Some people will never see your worth no matter how much you achieve," she said, adjusting the flame I had left too high. "The question is, do you still need their validation?" That question became the center of my reflection in the weeks that followed. I had spent so much time trying to prove my worth to the Wellingtons that at times I had started to see myself through their critical eyes. My professional success, though genuine, carried an element of validation, proving that I was worthy of their son, worthy of the last name I had never officially taken, but that still defined me socially in some way. Matt and I maintained limited contact during this time. Cautious text messages, occasional phone calls that always ended in the same stalemate. He was in therapy, working to understand his own patterns of passivity and complacency. He had cut off contact with his parents, something that visibly pained him, but that he seemed determined to uphold. "They need to understand that they crossed a line that can't be undone," he insisted during one of our conversations. "I'll never let them interfere in our lives again." There was sincerity in his words, but also a familiar pattern. Matt, always promising changes that somehow never fully materialized. Even his current act of rebellion, cutting off communication with his parents, felt less like a defense of our marriage and more like a temporary punishment that would eventually be lifted once the dust settled. Camilla, always my moral compass, offered a brutal perspective during a menu planning night for races. "The question isn't whether you can forgive Matt," she said, sorting through notes on new wines to add to the list. "It's whether you want to stay in a marriage where you'll always be seen as an outsider by his family. Because they will never change, Sophia. People like the Wellingtons don't change, they just adapt to maintain control." Her words hit me with the force of truth. For 12 years, I had believed that I would eventually earn the Wellingtons' acceptance through persistence, success, and genuine love for their son. Now, I was forced to confront the possibility that such acceptance would never come, and more importantly, that maybe I shouldn't want it anymore. It was at this point that I began to develop, not exactly a plan for revenge, but a strategy for self-determination. Regardless of my marriage's future, I realized I needed to redefine my relationship with the Wellington family on my own terms. First, I stopped trying to please or impress them. Years of proving my worth had only validated their belief that I needed their approval. I declined invitations to social events where I would be presented as the exotic chef daughter-in-law, and politely turned down requests to cook for the Wellingtons' charity functions. When Howard called me personally to request my participation in the Family Foundation's annual fundraiser dinner, I simply responded, "Unfortunately, I can't accommodate that request this year. I'm focusing on projects that honor my own community roots." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. The Wellingtons were used to their name opening all doors, their requests treated as commands. My polite but firm refusal represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Second, I began to explore my roots more deeply and with public pride. I launched a series of special dinners at races, celebrating the cuisine of Latin American housekeepers, recipes passed down by women who, like my mother, had worked in the homes of Boston's elite for generations. The event, which I called Las Invisibles, quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Every night, we filled the restaurant with a mix of curious regulars and Latin American families, moved by the sight of their culinary traditions being elevated and celebrated. I invited women like my mother to share their recipes, creating refined yet respectful versions of dishes that had nourished families for generations, while their creators remained in the shadows. The Boston Globe published a full-page feature on the initiative titled, "The Chef Giving Voice to the Invisible Ones." The main photo showed my mother and me side by side in the kitchen, our hands working together to shape empanadas. In the article, I spoke openly about my story, growing up as the daughter of a housekeeper, the struggle to be accepted in elite circles, and the importance of honoring the hands that had fed Boston for generations without recognition. Third, I established an educational foundation offering culinary scholarships for young people from immigrant communities, funded by the profits from my second cookbook. I named it the Isabel Rivera Foundation for Culinary Arts. A clear statement about the legacy I chose to honor. These actions weren't driven by bitterness, but by a newfound clarity. I was no longer trying to prove my worth to the Wellingtons. I was demonstrating that their standards of value had never been the only ones that mattered. One night, while working on a new recipe for the Haute Saint Los Invisibles menu, Camilla walked into the kitchen with a concerned expression. "Have you seen this?" she asked, holding out her tablet with an open email. It was a formal message from Evelyn Wellington, requesting a private meeting to now discuss unresolved family matters. The tone was surprisingly measured, almost conciliatory, completely unlike her usual aristocratic condescension. "What are you going to do?" Camilla asked. I looked down at the tortilla dough I was kneading, made from the recipe my grandmother had brought from El Salvador, adapted with techniques I had learned in Michelin-starred French kitchens. It was, like so much in my life, a fusion that didn't diminish its origins but elevated them. I'll meet her, I decided. Not for the reasons she expects, but for my own. When I finally responded to the email, I set the meeting in neutral territory, neither my restaurant nor the Wellington mansion. I chose a small cafe in Cambridge, far from Beacon Hill's social circles. The meeting location itself was a statement. I would no longer play by the Wellington's rules. The cafe I chose was one of those authentic, unpretentious places where college students mingled with professors and local workers. An environment that made Evelyn Wellington look out of place in her impeccable Chanel suit and heirloom pearls. I saw the exact moment she walked in, her gaze sweeping the space with a faint expression of discomfort, like someone accustomed to controlled environments suddenly placed in the democratic chaos of a truly public space. I raised my hand discreetly, and she walked toward me with the perfect posture cultivated by decades of elite education. Despite everything, I couldn't help but admire her composure. Evelyn Wellington was many things, but fragile was certainly not one of them. "Sophia," she greeted me with a nod, sitting down gracefully. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." I was curious, I admitted honestly as the waitress approached. Evelyn ordered an Earl Grey tea that I knew wouldn't meet her high standards. I ordered black coffee. Once we were alone again, Evelyn surprisingly got straight to the point, a departure from the usual social niceties she employed as a control tactic. "Sophia, we've made mistakes in how we treated you," she began, her cold eyes studying my reaction. There was no true remorse in her tone, only pragmatic calculation. "Howard and I would like to reevaluate our relationship. Matthew is clearly devoted to you, and we need to respect his choice." I noted her careful phrasing. She wasn't acknowledging my intrinsic worth, but conceding to Matt's determination. What she was offering wasn't a genuine apology, but a pragmatic truce, conditional acceptance based on the demonstration of her son's unwavering commitment. "We've been following your success with interest," she continued when I didn't respond immediately. "Your foundation is particularly impressive. Perhaps we could collaborate, bring the Wellington name into your project. Our foundation has substantial connections that could benefit your cause." That was when I fully understood what was happening. My success had altered the equation. The Wellingtons now saw me as a potential asset, not just an inadequacy to be tolerated. My foundation, my award-winning restaurant, my growing public influence, everything I had built despite them now made me worthy of consideration. A brief, incredulous laugh escaped before I could contain it. After 12 years, this is what finally makes me acceptable? The fact that I now represent some usefulness to the Wellington brand? Evelyn looked momentarily taken aback by my bluntness, another shift in the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for so long. "I'm not being fair," I continued, steadying my tone. "Actually, I appreciate your honesty, even if it wasn't intentional. We're finally having a real conversation without the usual filters. I don't know what Matthew has told you," she responded, regaining her composure. "But our concern has always been with long-term compatibility. Marriages between people from such different backgrounds often face challenges that—" "Evelyn," I interrupted calmly, setting my cup down on the table. "I appreciate your reconsideration, but I need to clarify something fundamental. I'm not seeking your approval or acceptance. That was left behind a long time ago." For the first time, genuine surprise crossed her face, possibly the first uncalculated emotion I had ever seen in her. "For 12 years, I tried to be enough for your family," I continued. "I worked tirelessly to prove my worth, to show that I deserved Matt's love despite my inadequate last name and my housekeeper mother. Now I understand that it was never about being enough. It was about being different. And that difference is not a deficiency I need to overcome. It is my strength. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a clarity that had eluded me through years of constant insecurity. The fact is, you're not here because you finally see me as a worthy human being, but because Matt has finally set a boundary you can't ignore. Or maybe because my public profile now makes it embarrassing to keep treating me as the inconvenience your family has to tolerate. Evelyn discreetly adjusted her pearl bracelet, a gesture I recognized as a sign of discomfort. "You're oversimplifying a complex situation," she said, her voice slightly tenser. "We have certain expectations and traditions that we have carried for generations. Matt understands that, even if he chooses to challenge them. As for the foundation, it honors women like my mother, who cleaned houses like yours while dreaming of better futures for their children," I replied, ignoring her attempt to shift the focus, adding the Wellington name would go against everything it stands for. I stood up to leave, but before I walked away, I felt the need for a final remark. "Please understand, I hold no personal resentment toward you, Evelyn. You are a product of the world that created you, just as I am a product of mine. The difference is that my world taught me to adapt, evolve, and embrace differences, while yours seems to demand conformity above all else." As I reached for my bag, Evelyn regained enough composure to deliver one last biting remark. "Do you really think you can survive in our world without our acceptance? Matthew will eventually miss the connections and privileges that come with the Wellington name." I turned back one last time. "Maybe. But he'll have to decide what he values more, his inherited privileges or his personal integrity. And I finally realized that I deserve someone who has already made that choice." I walked out of the cafe feeling both exhausted and invigorated. The conversation with Evelyn marked a turning point, not just in my relationship with the Wellingtons, but in my own sense of identity. The revenge I had vaguely imagined, demonstrative success, public recognition, proof of my worth, now seemed like a small and reactionary goal. True power lay in defining my own path, independent of their approval or disapproval. A week after my meeting with Evelyn, I received a surprise visit at the restaurant. Howard Wellington, without his wife, asked to speak with me in private. Unlike Evelyn, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable, almost vulnerable, a diminished version of the imposing patriarch I had known. "My family has been in Boston for 6 generations, he began, staring into his coffee cup instead of looking at me. "We were taught that preserving this lineage, this legacy, was our sacred responsibility." Then, unexpectedly, he told me something Matt didn't know. His own grandmother had been an Irish immigrant, a fact carefully omitted from the official family history. "Evelyn comes from purer blood," he explained with a bitter laugh. "I spent decades compensating for my less refined origins." This moment of honesty didn't erase years of harmful behavior, but it offered a glimpse into the underlying insecurity that fueled the Wellingtons' elitism. Howard didn't offer a direct apology, but a sort of acknowledgement. Matt is a better man than I am for having the courage to choose with his heart instead of his last name. When he left, I sat there for a long time, processing this unexpected revelation. The Wellingtons, who had long seemed monolithic in their certainty of superiority, were in reality built on their own insecurities and buried secrets, just like the rest of us. As for Matt, our journey of reconciliation was gradual and deliberate. After nearly 2 months apart, we agreed to start with marriage counseling, a neutral space where we could explore the deep wounds that had accumulated over the years. During our first session, Matt finally verbalized something I had always subconsciously known. I spent my whole life trying to be the son my parents wanted, while simultaneously trying to break free from their expectations. I let Sophia carry the weight of that contradiction, because it was easier than confronting it directly. This confession, difficult and honest, didn't instantly heal our relationship, but it created space for genuine rebuilding. Matt kept his distance from his parents for several months, though I eventually encouraged him to establish an adult relationship with healthy boundaries, not for me, but for his own inner peace. "You don't have to choose between me and them," I told him during one of our nighttime walks, a new ritual we had established for important conversations. "But we need to completely redefine how this dynamic works. I can't and won't keep trying to earn a place where I'm not genuinely valued. Surprisingly, Lucas became a regular ally, often visiting us in our temporary apartment. We had decided to sell the house in Cambridge. It carried too many memories of the old dynamic. Matt's older brother, once the most openly dismissive, Wellington now seemed genuinely interested in building an authentic relationship with us. "You opened the door," he admitted during an impromptu dinner in our new kitchen. "You made it easier for the rest of us to question these unspoken rules." I discovered that Lucas had recently started seeing a public school teacher, someone who, like me, didn't fit the Wellington mold. "Before you, I never would have considered that a possibility," he confessed. "Some of us needed to see the example." My career continued to flourish in ways that now felt more authentic and less reactive. The Los Invisibles project grew, beyond its origins as a series of special dinners, transforming into a cookbook that highlighted the women behind the kitchens of New England's elite mansions. For the launch, I invited not just food critics and culinary celebrities, but also dozens of housekeepers and their families, including some who had worked for the Wellingtons over the years. I opened a third restaurant, more casual and accessible, offering simplified versions of the recipes that had made races famous. Mesa Común became a place where college students and working families could experience food inspired by my heritage without the price tag of an award-winning restaurant. The Isabel Rivera Foundation expanded to include a residential program for young chefs from marginalized communities, offering not just culinary training but also business mentorship to help them eventually open their own establishments. "This is what I always wanted for you," my mother said, watching the first 15 scholarship recipients working in the foundation's kitchen. Not just success, but purpose. Evelyn, as expected, kept her distance after our conversation at the cafe. However, it became impossible for her to ignore me completely, especially when Boston Magazine named me Citizen of the Year for my work with immigrant communities. The awards ceremony, attended by the city's social elite, put her in the uncomfortable position of having to greet me publicly with a stiff smile and polite words. "Your work with underprivileged youth is admirable," she said during our brief encounter, each word clearly painful for her. "They're not underprivileged, Evelyn," I gently corrected. "They're undervalued. There's a crucial difference." Matt, finally freed from his constant need for his parents' approval, flourished professionally in ways he had never imagined possible. He published a critically acclaimed book exploring immigrant narratives in American literature, a project he had hesitated to pursue, fearing it would be too political for his family's taste. "You've always been my inspiration," he told me on the night of the book launch, holding my hand with a confidence that had been missing for so long. "Not just because of your story, but because of your courage to live it authentically when it would have been so much easier to conform to other people's expectations." Our new home, a spacious loft in a restored industrial building, became a gathering place for diverse communities where scholars, chefs, artists, and activists regularly came together. Isabel, whose health had stabilized with proper care, became the heart of these gatherings, sharing stories and wisdom that would have once been considered too simple for Wellington circles. On our 15th wedding anniversary, Matt and I renewed our vows in an intimate ceremony at the community garden we had helped create near the Isabel Rivera Foundation. Among the guests were Lucas and his now fiancée, a few extended Wellington family members who had chosen genuine relationships over rigid tradition, and Howard, alone but present, taking a tentative step toward redemption. Evelyn did not attend. Her absence a predictable choice that did nothing to diminish our joy. In fact, there was a certain poetic perfection in it. The matriarch who once declared that our son deserves someone from a better family now found herself excluded from the family her son had chosen to build. 2 weeks after the vow renewal, I received a small box in the mail. Inside, with no card or note, was an old Wellington family heirloom, a delicate sapphire brooch I had once admired during a family dinner years ago. I never asked Howard if he was the one who sent it, and he never brought it up. Some reconciliations are better left unspoken. True revenge, I realized, wasn't proving my worth to those who refused to see it. It was creating a life so rich, authentic, and full that their opinions became irrelevant, It was turning humble beginnings from a whispered insult into a declared source of strength and purpose. One evening, as I prepared dinner for a group of Foundation scholars in our kitchen, Matt watched from across the island, his eyes reflecting the same love that had drawn me to him so many years ago. "What do you think your parents would say if they could see you now?" he asked, knowing how much my parents, my late father and my mother, who was sleeping in the next room, had shaped my journey. My father would say he never doubted it. I smiled, chopping cilantro with the precision I had refined in professional kitchens. And my mother would say that the best revenge is a life well lived. After 12 years of marriage, when my in-laws declared that their son deserved someone from a better family, they inadvertently freed me from the need for their approval. Revenge wasn't a spectacular dish served in a dramatic moment, but a life lived on my own terms. A slow, satisfying, and nourishing meal that continues to feed not just me, but everyone who has chosen to sit at my table.